So without further ado, let's get started with the event.
Right.
So we right now we have the honor of hosting Valerie B. Jarrett, who is currently a senior distinguished fellow at the University of Chicago Law School and a senior advisor to the Obama Foundation. Ms. Jarrett was the longest serving senior advisor to President Barack Obama. She oversaw the offices of public engagement and intergovernmental affairs and chaired the White House Council on Women and Girls. She led the Obama administration's efforts to expand and strengthen access to the middle class and boost American businesses and our economy. And she championed the creation of equality and opportunity for all Americans and economically and politically empowering women in the United States and around the world. But she also has a background in both the public and private sectors. She currently serves as the chairman of the board of When We All Vote and is a co-chair of the United State of Women. And her New York Times bestselling memoir, Finding My Voice, My Journey to the West Wing and the Path Forward, was just published in 2019. And believe it or not, Ms. Jarrett's also a fellow Cardinal. She received her BA in psychology from Stanford University in 1978 and her JD from the University of Michigan Law School in 1981. And this conversation is going to be moderated by the amazing Antonia Hellman. She's currently the co-director of Stanford and Government Special Events Committee, and she's the incoming chair of Stanford and Government for the 2020-2021 academic year. So without further ado, let's welcome our guest, Ms. Valerie Jarrett. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.
It's good Thank you. I want to reiterate what Sriram said. We're really excited to be hosting you tonight. And we know that these are really difficult circumstances, and we're really glad that we could work this out. Thank you to your team and also to the Haas Center and the Stanford and Government Special Events Committee for really pulling this all together. We're incredibly grateful for your time and for your desire to speak with us. So I think I wanted to start off with a little bit of your background and kind of starting way at the beginning with your childhood. You had a particularly interesting upbringing, and you were raised in Iran until the age of 5. You described this as being a really happy life in your book, and I'm wondering, how did this affect your view on the United States?
It's a good question to start with. So the reason why I was born in Iran is that my dad, who was a physician, grew up in Washington, D.C., married my mom, an educator who was in Chicago, and they went off to Colorado when my father was in the Army. When he was leaving the Army, he wanted to find a job at a major teaching hospital around the United States. And as an African American, he could not find a position comparable to his white counterparts. So he and my mom, who were adventuresome spirits to say the least, started looking for job opportunities outside of the United States. And he landed a job to chair the Department of Pathology and help start a brand new hospital in the city of Shiraz, Iran. Now, they knew nothing about Iran. They didn't speak the language. They knew that Iran and the United States were strong allies back then. And the Shah of Iran was very interested in improving the healthcare delivery system and was putting resources behind it. And that's all he needed. And so off they went to Iran. About a year and a half later, I was born, the second baby born in the hospital my dad started. They practiced on some other poor baby first. And then we lived there till I was 5. And he did research in Iran that caught the attention of some folks at the Galton Labs at University of College London. So my parents and I went there for a year and then to Chicago. And we got back to Chicago because he gave a paper at an international conference. And the dean of the University of Chicago Medical Center was at the conference and heard about his research that began in Iran and offered him a tenure track position in Chicago, where my mom's family lived in the same community as the University of Chicago. And so he used to often say to me growing up that sometimes the shortest distance to where you want to go means you have to be prepared to take the long way around. And they sure took the long way around. But those early years in Iran were formative in a few ways. First of all, I think that by living on a hospital compound with children from all over the world, I expect to find something in common with people. And look, we all spoke different languages. We learned each other's languages. By the time I left Iran, I was fluent in, well, kind of fluent in English, Farsi, French. And I have this same expectation today that people are people, and that if you search for commonality, you're going to find it. The other thing I think that was pretty fundamental about that experience is that I think folks who have not lived outside of the United States, particularly in countries that were severely underdeveloped, as Iran was back then, we take a lot of our privileges here for granted. And so whether it's the privileges of being in a democracy, the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to assemble, etc., or whether it's not having to worry about what you were eating and what you were drinking for fear of contracting illnesses for which there were not good treatments back then. And so that appreciation, I think, for the United States, not taking it for granted, is something that was kind of ingrained in me by my life experiences in Iran. And then the final really important, I think, lesson that I learned from those years in Iran is that it gave me a global perspective. My father, after we returned to the United States, continued to do research all around the world. And so we'd spend our summers traipsing across Africa and actually down through Mexico, as well as he was studying diseases, genetic diseases that were tied to geography. And I got this perspective that, the United States is an amazing country, but it's actually not the only country on earth, and that we can learn a great deal outside of our shores. And I think those early lessons shaped me in fundamental ways, even though when I came to the United States, what a culture shock it was for me. And I got bullied in school. I had a British accent. That 1 year in Great Britain, I developed a British accent. I was born in a country nobody had ever heard of back then. And I think that bullying kind of turned me into a shy person, which you probably find hard to believe since I have not stopped talking since we began this conversation. But that's how I was back then. And I didn't like to talk about Iran and Great Britain because it made me different. And I just wanted to be like all the other kids. When they went to summer camp, we were going across Africa, and you come back in the fall and people say, well, what did you do on your summer vacation? And I never wanted to talk about it because it just seemed so different. And now I realize what a privilege it was to have had those early experiences, but it took me a long time to appreciate that we are our stories and we are all different. And I think kids can be really mean to one another and tease one another. And it took me a while to get over that and to kind of come out of my shell. And if you think about it, for the first portion of my life, nobody had ever heard of Iran. And then when I was in law school, when President Carter was president, we had the Iran hostage crisis, which I'm sure you all have studied in the history books. And so then everybody had heard of Iran. And let's face it, it's kind of gone downhill since then. But at the time when we were there, we did have a strong relationship with the country, and I learned an amazing amount about the world, and it gave me a unique appreciation for how the United States fits into that world order.
I think that's really fascinating, and it's crucial, especially now, to have a global perspective when approaching policy. And so I think that upbringing.
Yeah, our big problems, all of the big problems we have, from climate change to poverty to pandemics, can't be solved by one country alone. They really require cooperation. And that's a piece of the puzzle, is that you can't really have a country that goes its own way. We have to figure out how to be a part of the world. And in fact, the world looks to the United States to lead.
Right. I could not agree more. Fast forwarding a little bit until, after you came back to the States, your father worked at the University of Chicago, and thankfully, you didn't go to the University of Chicago. You went to Stanford.
Yes,
and
section, I might add.
Can you tell us about how your time at Stanford impacted your desire to pursue a career in public service? And when you finished Stanford, what exactly was your plan?
Yeah, well, so you have to understand, I decided I wanted to go to Stanford my freshman year in high school. And there was nothing anyone could tell me that would change my mind. And the reason I decided to go to Stanford is that when I was a freshman in high school, I was standing in the library at the University of Chicago Laboratory Schools, where I went to high school, and a very handsome man walked in, and the librarian said, oh, Valerie, you should meet John Hope Franklin Jr. He was the son of a very famous historian who was on the faculty at the University of Chicago at the time, and he was at Stanford. And I thought, I'm going to Stanford because I want to go and meet you. Now, of course, he wasn't even going to be there by the time I got there, but that is what stuck it in my head. I'd never been to California, let alone on campus. I just had it in my mind that this is where I was going to go. And so there's nothing like getting what you want. So I went there prepared to really enjoy myself and it's interesting, my college counselor, first of all, told me I would never get in. And that had an effect on me, because when I did get in, even though I applied to 9 schools, I got in all 9, but because he'd said I wasn't going to get in Stanford, I kind of thought, well, maybe they made a mistake and maybe I'm really not supposed to be here. So he did kind of mess with my head a little bit. But when I got there, I remember the first day, and I lived in Lagunitas Court, Ujima, and the house parent, I don't even know if you guys still have house parents, but we had adults who lived in the dorm with us. And he gathered us all together and he said, I just want to tell you, I want to go over the rules. And so I pull out a little notepad to take down, the rules. And he goes, ha, there are none. And I was like, yes, what could be better? And I think part of what he was trying to say to us is that this is a place where you can be creative and experiment and try classes that you might never have thought you were interested in, and make friends from around the world and people who come from different backgrounds, who have different interests themselves, different political affiliations, and be curious, be intellectually curious. Don't feel bound by any constraints other than, core decency and treating one another with respect. But it was a liberating feeling, and I embraced that, and I loved my 4 years. And in fact, it wasn't until I was, I suppose it wasn't until I went to the White House that I stopped saying the best 4 years of my life were the 4 years that I went to college. I just enjoyed every minute of it. Now, I do think, I wish that I'd done things like I wish I'd played golf. Why? I still don't have any interest in golf, but there was a golf course right behind Lake Lagunitas, and you don't even have a lake there. We had a lake. I don't know why I didn't take sailing lessons. So there were some things that I should have done that I didn't do, but I guess we all have those kind of regrets. But I took a wide range of classes, and I think it prepared me for the next chapter in terms of just teaching you how to think and teaching you how to be intellectually curious, socially curious, and realizing that learning is a lifelong responsibility. And that once you leave school, it's really on you to figure it out. But when I was at Stanford, I started out pre-med, I think because my dad was a doctor. And one semester I did 2 things. I visited my boyfriend who was in medical school anatomy class where they were dissecting a cadaver. And it was the same semester that I took organic chemistry. So that was the end of pre-med. And then I ended up majoring in psychology, which made all the sense in the world. And it has helped me enormously throughout my career. But I didn't know what I was going to do next. And my best friend had gone to law school. She's 2 years older than I was. She'd become my friend my freshman year at Stanford. And she said, go to law school. And then everybody at Stanford had a plan, and everyone was making these grandiose 10-year plans. And so I thought, well, all right, I guess I need a plan too. And so my plan was to go to law school, go back to Chicago probably. I was getting a little homesick by then. Figure out my passion in the law, which I didn't know. Fall in love, get married, have a baby before 30, thinking about that biological clock, which fortunately for you ticks a lot later now, and live happily ever after. And that was my plan. And I went off and I did that plan. I went right to law school. I went to a great law firm. I went to an even better law firm. I married the boy next door, figuratively, in that our moms had grown up together, our fathers were friends, our grandparents were friends. He was a doctor, my dad was a doctor. What could go wrong, right? Perfect. Well, plenty could go wrong and did go wrong, I would add. And so my book begins 10 years after my 10-year plan, where I'm sitting in my fancy office at a big law firm in Chicago, and the plan had crumbled. I wasn't happy in my marriage. I wasn't happy in the practice of law. I did do one thing right in that 10 years, and that's have my daughter, who's best thing I've ever done in life by far, my proudest accomplishment. But everything else was pretty much rock bottom. And I looked at this precious baby, and I thought, if I stay married to this man and if I stay practicing law at a big firm, you will never be proud of me. You will have a miserable mom. And so for the first time, I kind of listened to this quiet voice that we all have inside of us. And a friend of mine said, why don't you consider public service? And you'll be a part of, he said, you'll be part of something bigger and more important than yourself. And those words resonated with me. And I took a leap of faith. I took a huge cut in pay. I walked into a cubicle with a window facing an alley, and I never looked back. And so part of the lesson in my book is to not feel like you've got to follow that straight and narrow plan that you made up at a time when you didn't even know what you were going to want 10 years from there, but to be flexible and take advantage of opportunities when they knock and force opportunities when you're miserable and they're not knocking.
And taking that risk certainly paid off. I mean, in 1991, when you were working for the mayor of Chicago, you met a woman named Michelle Robinson who wanted to join your office. And she introduced you to her fiance, Barack Obama. And I'm wondering, what was that meeting like, the first meeting? Did you have any inclination that this was going to be something huge, that it was going to shape all of your lives?
Well, she blew me away in her interview. And I was deputy chief of staff for Mayor Daley at the time, looking to recruit people to join our office. And I still remember her walking in my office. She was tall and handsomely dressed, simply dressed though, barely any makeup, her hair pulled back, shook my hand, looked me right in the face, saw her resume sitting on my desk, never mentioned anything about Princeton undergrad, Harvard Law School. She told me her story, and it's kind of the quintessential American story that you all probably now know pretty well. And she also said to me that in the last year of both her dad and her best friend from college had died suddenly, and that it had really shaken her to her core, and she was looking for something purposeful in life. And since for different reasons, my daughter, and thinking, will she be proud of me, I had done the same kind of pivot. I was just totally enamored with her and offered her a job on the spot. And she said wisely, well, let me go back and talk it over with my fiance. I'll get back to you. So a few days later, we were talking, and I said, well, and she said, well, he doesn't think it's a good idea. And I'm like, well, who's your fiance, and what do we care what he thinks? And she said, well, his name is Barack Obama, and he started his career as a community organizer on the south side of Chicago, and he's not sure that it makes sense for me to go right from a law firm into a political environment. And she said, he's thinking, well, you had 4 years to practice law for the city before you entered the political office. And so would you have dinner with us to talk about it? And I said, yes. And boy, am I glad I did. And the dinner is one that was important for a few reasons. One, as people do to just kind of break the ice, he said to me, so where are you from? And I said, Chicago. And he said, did you grow up here? I said, yes. And he said, were you born here? And it's like, oh, golly, are we going there already? Just like right off the bat. And so I said, no, I was born in Iran. And I kind of prepared myself for the normal reaction that I would get from people. And to the contrary, he said, well, that's interesting. What were your parents doing in Iran? And so I explained the story. I explained to you all. And then he said, I lived in Indonesia for a while. And I said, well, that's interesting. What were you doing in Indonesia? And he told me the story about his mom moving to Indonesia. And when we started talking about our experiences, both living outside of the United States, we reached the same three conclusions I shared with you earlier about walking into a room and being able to meet anyone and find something in common, knowing that the United States is not the only country on earth, and knowing that we sometimes take for granted what we have here. And so we bonded around that, and Michelle and I bonded around coming from two-parent households where our parents loved us unconditionally and sacrificed mightily for us to get the best education in the world, and provided us with just this setting high expectations, but then a safety net if we stumbled and fell. And so I bonded with each of them in different ways. And at the end of the dinner, to answer your question, I remember thinking, they're just an extraordinary couple, both individually, but together. And he just finished law school at the time. He expressed a little bit of interest in politics. And I thought, maybe one day you could be mayor of Chicago. That's about as high as I thought he would go. because it just never occurred to me that I could be sitting having dinner with a guy who'd one day become president.
Right, and little did you know that just a few years down the line, you'd be sitting in a very different place.
Very different.
And speaking of, we're currently in a state of crisis with COVID-19, not just in the United States, but around the world. And you were in the White House during several crises, namely the H1N1 epidemic in the States, the Zika epidemic across North and South America, the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, and the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. How did you witness President Obama and his team react to these disasters? And were he still in office today, what do you think his approach would be to COVID-19?
Well, so for all the examples that you gave, the first thing you do is try to gather the facts, try to understand the science of the oil spill, like why in the world is all that oil pouring out of the ocean? You try to understand these diseases that you named, the H1N1, Zika, Ebola. You do as much fact gathering as you can when those are outside of our country by talking to the leaders of those countries and the health departments on the ground with whom their counterparts in the United States should have good relations, because we all have a common interest in making sure that the world is healthy. And so you'll find that there's a whole network of public health officials across the world who collaborate. In the case of the oil spill, it was important to us to stay in touch with the 5 governors in the affected states. And one of the gifts President Obama gave me was on the second day of the oil spill, he said, I want you to speak to all 5 governors on a conference call every day until we figure out how to plug the hole. That way they'll know that any issues and concerns and questions that they have, they'll raise with you and you'll come right and tell me. And I thought, okay, I can do that. That's what, a week, 2 weeks, 3 months, 7 days a week for 3 months. I talked to 5 Republican, I might add, governors, a few of whom I developed a really close relationship with. And so information, transparency, evidence-based strategies that will work. With the oil spill, we had no idea how to close that. And so there was an enormous team of scientists who came together to try to figure it out. And ultimately, our energy secretary on the back of a napkin figured it out, a brilliant man that he was. And each one was different. I think the one that frightened me the most was Ebola, because the symptoms are so horrendous. And for that one, not only did we have an all-of-government, federal government approach here in the United States, but then President Obama rolled up his sleeves and got on the phone with world leaders all around the world and said, look, we have to contain the Ebola where it is, or else it's going to spread around the world. And our Department of Defense went and they were building hospitals and all kinds of facilities to make sure that the folks who did contract the illness were able to be treated decently and well in a healthy environment. And we were extraordinarily transparent with the American people. I think people, and you all might not remember it, but people were terrified about Ebola. People were terrified about Zika. My daughter at that point was childbearing age and was really worried as we looked at these horrendous deformities that children who were born when their moms have Zika tended to have, and we were not at all certain that we could keep it from our shores. It got as far as Puerto Rico, but it did not come onto the mainland. And so, to say it again, start with the science, start with the evidence, start with communicating with the parties that you need to cooperate with you so that you can have a whole of government approach, whole of government here and whole of government globally where appropriate, and be transparent and open with the American people. And we learned a lot from those experiences. And at the end of our time in Washington, our National Security Council prepared a report, a rather lengthy 69-page report, which you guys could see online. It was really kind of, this is like the step-by-step that you would want to follow in the case of a pandemic. And back in 2014, President Obama gave a speech where he said, within the next 5 years, we should expect to have a global pandemic. All of the indicators are there, and so we have to start preparing today for what might not happen for 5 years. And unfortunately, that kind of fell on deaf ears. in terms of appropriating of funds. And we also created an office within the White House, within the National Security Council, focusing solely on pandemics. And we set up offices around the world so that our scientists would be located in countries where it was likely that a pandemic might pop up, so that they could have information immediately. Because in a situation like this, time is of the essence, to say the least. Every single day counts. And so hopping on it as soon as possible. And you were in this delicate balance between scaring people to death and educating them about how to take appropriate precautions. And that's the art of leadership, is figuring out how to be honest and direct and open with people, empower them to feel as though they can do something about it, and then give them a realistic appraisal of the fear. And with Ebola, I mean, I cannot tell you the phone calls I used to get from my own relatives saying, is our entire country going to be infected with Ebola? And me saying, no, if we do our job right, we'll be able to contain it. But these are hard problems to solve. I do not want to in any way imply this is easy to do. It takes an enormous amount of rigor and intellectual creativity and relationships to build the diplomatic network that you need for this kind of global cooperation.
Thank you for that answer. It's something that's definitely on all of our minds right now and that we're all really worried about.
Well, I will say one more thing just in terms of government. I think this has been a very painful civics lesson, in addition to just the incredible loss of life and people who've lost their jobs and first responders and essential workers who are out there every single day putting their lives on the line. But it has also laid bare how important government is in our daily lives, and not just the federal government, but the state government. You all are seeing governors. Many of you may not have even heard of the governors before, and now they're front and center, getting enormous attention from the press because they're so close to the ground. Our nation's mayors are also very visible. People in the public health. I don't know whether Tony Fauci was a household name before this COVID-19 pandemic, but I will tell you, within the White House, we hung on his every single word. But what this has done is kind of laid bare where there are weaknesses in government and where there are strengths in government, and it has also laid bare the disparities that we have around our country. I mean, it is not an accident that communities of color and poor communities are having a disproportionate negative impact from this virus. And so closing those disparity gaps is something we should all be challenging ourselves to do as we move forward, as we moved out of this. And also figuring out a way where people who have been ill have paid leave, have paid sick days, have the safety net around them. And look, I've been advocating for paid leave forever. I think everyone should have paid sick days. We're the only developed country in the world that doesn't have a national paid leave policy, and over 40 million Americans don't have paid sick days. And this virus shows you, do you really want somebody showing up to work at a restaurant when they are sick? But they have no choice if they don't have paid sick days because they can't afford to lose the day's work. So it has been a painful lesson, but I'm hoping coming out of it that we are armed with those lessons and we move forward and take the United States to a stronger position so we're better prepared the next time something like this happens, and it will. It could happen again as early as this fall, and that we are creating more of a safety net for the most vulnerable among us, because in this very, very wealthy country, we shouldn't have the disparities in healthcare and in health outcomes that we do.
And speaking of government response, it's really important to talk about policy. So you witnessed the Affordable Care Act from start to finish. And I'm wondering, how do you anticipate COVID-19 will impact health policy moving forward?
Well, in a number of ways. Look, for the people who've lost their jobs and their health insurance, right now they're able to go and sign up in the exchanges and get health insurance. They have to be opened up by the federal government, but they can be, and people could sign up and get insurance through the exchanges. There are, I think it's 14 states that have yet to expand the Medicaid provisions of the Affordable Care Act, which increase the number of people who are eligible for Medicaid. And in those 14 states, people are slipping through the cracks because they don't have enough insurance, and they can't afford insurance. They need a subsidy, and that subsidy was available under the Affordable Care Act, but there are states that didn't take advantage of that ability to get the subsidy into the hands of the people who need it most. And usually those are the lower wage workers. Those are the people with the health disparities. And so the folks who are the most vulnerable, I think, are suffering, notwithstanding the fact that there is the Affordable Care Act in place. And so I think going forward, I should add one more thing. There was resources put in the Affordable Care Act to study these health disparities so that we could try to close the gap. And that needs to be funded again. And then we need to put efforts into figuring out ways in which to go into vulnerable populations and make sure that they're getting the preventive care that they need so that they don't end up with diabetes, hypertension, heart diseases, some of these chronic illnesses that we know exacerbate the outcomes of a pandemic such as the COVID-19. So I think there's a lot of work that we can do to build on the foundation of the Affordable Care Act, but it has certainly shown where we have vulnerabilities around the country, and there are still far too many people who are suffering and even dying at home because they don't think that they can afford to go to a hospital.
And COVID-19 really has impacted all of our lives in a serious way, and it's also impacted the upcoming election. And so since the election is slated to happen in just a few short months, how have you seen campaigns shift their approaches in light of the current circumstances? And how do you imagine COVID-19 will impact the way that the elections are carried out in November?
Well, look, I think everybody's going to have to get a lot more creative. You're not going to have, in my opinion, it's not likely that you're going to have big rallies. And I fear that in states that have opened before, the CDC guidance instructed them to do so, might have an uptick in the virus. And so will we really see rallies this summer? I doubt it. We haven't decided yet about the conventions, but I think the more prudent thing would be to plan for not being able to have these gatherings if I were advising the campaigns, and look for ways of doing what you all do best, which is use technology to get the message out. I've been on a lot of Zoom conference calls. In fact, right before I came on here, I was on a fundraiser for this organization that you mentioned in the introduction that I chair the board of, called When We All Vote. And we created it a couple of years ago, right after the end of the Obama administration. Michelle Obama launched it. And her goal was, in a nonpartisan way, to help educate and motivate people to appreciate the nexus between voting and the kind of government we have. And disproportionately young people, that's all you guys, don't vote. And the theory behind the case is if we can reach people for their first election, the data shows that if you vote in that first election, you're more likely to become a lifelong voter. But you have to feel that your vote matters. You have to feel that it's worthwhile. You have to understand the impact that every vote can have on the outcome of elections. And I'm not just talking about the presidential election. It matters who's on your local city council, who's the mayor, who's on the county board, who are the prosecutors making important decisions over our lives, who are judges that are elected, who's in the state legislature drawing important lines and allocating resources, and who's in Congress providing a check and balance to the executive branch. All of those elections are important. And I think what's beginning to happen that's so troubling, since 100 million eligible Americans didn't vote in the last election, is that people are beginning to say, it's just a mess, throwing up their hands and just saying, I want to shun the entire thing. And look, I get that politics looks messy, but public service is vital to our lives. And you have to be able to distinguish the two and look for the people that you think will be good public servants. And that should transcend the politics of the moment, if you will. But back to When We All Vote. So it's a nonpartisan 501c3, and we're looking at changing the culture in our country around voting. And we're asking leaders on college campuses and high schools, in businesses, mayors, governors, everyone, get involved, create your own voting squad, and talk about voting. Talk about the issues that you care about and see which candidates you think represent your interests, your values, and we'll go in there and fight for you. And then encouraging people to vote for whoever meets that bill. And it was really important to us that it be nonpartisan, so it's not about one election or one candidate, but it's really more about a culture. And the challenge of this current environment is, well, many of you may have seen the news in Wisconsin when they had their primary and people were lined up close together trying to exercise this fundamental right and responsibility, but yet putting their health in jeopardy, and they shouldn't have to choose. So there are three important policies that we're advocating for right now through When We All Vote. Number one, we think everybody should be able to vote by mail. Military have been voting by mail, Arizona, Washington State, there are many places that have mandatory voting by mail. And so we should be able to execute that, and the Postal Service should have the funds appropriated in order to be able to meet that increase in demand. Number two, we should expand early vote. And you'll appreciate this. Look, if you have an exam on election day and you're cramming for it at the last minute, you may not be able to go out and vote. It might not be the first thing that comes to your mind. If you're your parents, you might have an important meeting at work. You might just not be, you may not have the kind of work that allows you to take off during the hours that the polls are open. And so for a long time now, we've been encouraging states to expand the opportunity to vote early. And in this pandemic season, it's more important than ever, because if people vote early, spread out over a larger number of days, obviously you'll have fewer people showing up on election day. And then the final policy that we're advocating for is that everybody should be able to register to vote online. And at some point, we think everybody should be able to vote online. We're not there yet, but we should certainly be able to register online. And if we do those three, then I think we will ameliorate some of the challenges that the COVID-19 is presenting to our November elections.
I think those are all fantastic points, and Stanford Votes is behind all of those points. Stanford in Government has been really ramping up efforts with their Stanford Votes initiative to make sure that students at Stanford and also at other college campuses across the US really understand the importance of participating in democracy. So I do want to leave some time to open it up to the audience for some Q&A, but I do have one final question for you, which is, what advice do you have for young people that are interested in pursuing jobs in public service?
Do it. Try it. Now look, some people spend their entire career in the public sector. I have spent about half of my career in the public sector and half in the private sector. And I have enjoyed going back and forth, and I've learned an enormous amount in each that helped me with the other. But if you have a craving for public service, then I think one suggestion is to try internships while you're still in school so you can test it out a bit. I'm a huge advocate for starting local. And the reason why is that in local government, your constituents are proximate, if you will, in that they know your name, you've visited their community, they have your phone number many times, they know where you live, they lobby you in the grocery store on the weekends. It's a 24/7 exercise, and I think that's a great orientation to public service, because it is public service. You are a public servant, and believe me, I felt like a servant a many a day. And that was great training. It teaches you to listen. It teaches you to understand that your role is to help the people that you represent fulfill their hopes and dreams, not imposing yours on them. And so that's why you have to listen and engage. And that experience I had in local government was extraordinarily helpful to me in the White House, because I think oftentimes in Washington, where the numbers are huge and you're dealing with macroeconomics, it would be easy to lose sight of the people whose lives are going to be directly impacted by the decisions you make. And the responsibilities I had in the White House, both overseeing the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs, the mayors, the governors, all the elected officials outside of Congress, and public engagement, were designed to bring those ideas into the White House. And those early experiences I had in government really trained me for that. So that's like a unabashed promotion of local government. But it never occurred to me when I was at Stanford to try to become a White House fellow. That's another incredible experience. And I used to have get together with each of the White House fellow classes while we were there. And it's an incredible group of folks from all over the world with all different kinds of backgrounds, well, all over the country, not the world, but some from outside of the country too, who are now here. And terrific experience. And so it doesn't really, I guess my advice is, it doesn't really matter where you start, just get going. And keep an open mind and look for new opportunities that will inevitably knock at inopportune moments, and be sufficiently confident with this extraordinary education that you're receiving that you can afford to take some risks. And I think there are a lot of folks who can't take risks. There's no margin for error. And that is not you. And that is a privilege that you have earned. But take advantage of that privilege by going out there and trying some new ideas, and certainly considering service. And there are just so many different ways that you can get in, and any one of them will give you a skill set that will help you as you build the blocks of your future.
Thank you so much. I think right now we're turning it over to audience questions, and I think Shriram's gonna lead this one.
Okay.
Yep. First off, thank you so much. That was incredibly fascinating to hear. And you touched on the end about public service. So our first question is actually going to come from another SIG member, Rachel Kim, and she wanted to ask, do you actually, you know what? Instead of that, I'll let her ask the question. Rachel, you can talk right now.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to ask you, do you ever wish that you went straight into a career of public service, or do you feel like your early career in the private sector was helpful in some way or another later on during your public service career? And thank you so much for the amazing talk.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. No, I have no regrets. And I was so miserable at that law firm. I used to just sit in my office, and if any of you read my book, my first scene in the book was sitting in this fancy office with my chair turned away from the door, looking out the window and crying. And I was trying to figure out whose life is this, because it couldn't be my life. But in those 6 years, I learned a lot. I learned how to be a really good, disciplined, rigorous lawyer. We had the luxury of being able to spend a lot of money, of our clients' money, on my education. And so when I went into the law department for the city of Chicago, I went in with a huge bump up in terms of my learning curve compared to my peers in the law department in the city. And one of the reasons why I was able to get a huge promotion when I was in the law department came from the experience that I brought to the table from the law firm. So although those 6 years were the most miserable of my life, I certainly developed the skill set that came in handy. And I'll say this as well, that when I left, I spent 8 years full-time in city government, first in the law department, then the mayor's office, then I ran the Department of Planning and Development for 4 years. And that's, and I met Michelle in the mayor's office, and then we also worked together in the planning department. And when I left the planning department, I went to go and work for a real estate developer who I had negotiated on the other side of the table with. And he had been so decent, which is not necessarily common with real estate developers, that I've been impressed with him. And he was the receiver for the Chicago Public Housing Authority because the Housing Authority had been grossly incompetent, and so its responsibilities had been turned over to a private developer receiver. And the work that I enjoyed doing the most when I worked for the planning department were these great neighborhood developments that we were involved in all over the city, many that housed public housing, which we tore down and then built mixed income housing back on site. And so I went to a development company in the private sector, but I was able to continue the work that I cared most passionately about from the time when I was in the public sector. And then after 11 years at the Habitat Company, when President Obama was elected, I go to Washington having been a CEO of a company, which was important considering we're in the middle of this horrible economic crisis when it took office. And I had all this experience with public engagement and working with mayors and other local elected officials. And as I said before, listening to constituents. And so I think for me, the going back and forth worked. And I don't regret those 6 miserable years. I learned a lot. And in fact, as circuitous as my career seemed at the time I was making all these decisions, it was hard for me after having practiced law a total of 10 years, 6 in the public sector, 4 for the city of Chicago. When I moved to the mayor's office, I was suddenly no longer a lawyer. And I had defined myself as being a lawyer. And then I haven't practiced law since, and honestly, I haven't missed it. But at the time, it was a huge swerve, if you will. And so I guess the point I'm making is, looking back, all of those swerves made sense, but at the time it seemed like chaos. And so you learn to embrace the chaos.
Great. I think that leads into, I guess, the next question perfectly. So the next question is going to be coming from Amanda Harris. So Amanda, you can ask a question.
Amanda.
Hi, Ms. Jarrett. It's an honor to speak with you. So my question was, how can we as young people help counter the pervasive cynicism towards our democratic and institutions and processes that you were mentioning earlier?
Great question. It's up to each and every one of you. But you have to feel empowered to recognize what you can do with your voice. And some of it begins with helping to educate yourself about how important these institutions are to our lives, educating yourself as to who are the candidates who are running to lead these institutions, and then mobilizing people to want to influence the outcomes. I'll give you a good example. The young folks from Parkland, the Marjorie Stone High School in Florida that had the horrible school shooting a few years ago. I got to know several of those students pretty well. We were actively involved in the March for Our Lives that they sponsored. And the summer after that following summer, a group of them decided to go on a bus tour around the country and advocating for states to change their laws to make it harder for people to have access to guns who are a danger either to themselves or to others, and to encourage people who cared about this issue to register to vote. They went to red states and blue states, and they made a huge impact. And the sense that they feel, the confidence that they feel, beginning with their own state of Florida, where the governor there had an A+ rating from the NRA, but they were able to get some reforms passed simply by showing up and using social media in extraordinarily creative ways. And they mobilized the country. I mean, that March for Our Lives had demonstrations and rallies all across our country, millions and millions of people, started by a bunch of high school kids. And so lifting up those stories so that you can begin to understand and appreciate, because sometimes it just seems like it's just overwhelming, it's just too much, our problems are too big. And then you see a Greta Thunberg, who's another young person who now is a global leader on climate change. And you don't have to be the global leader, but you can make an impact among your peer group and among your cohort. And so helping people see that nexus between their lives and the government, use the COVID-19, it's a great case study, and where government has worked and where there have been some challenges. And that should educate us about what it is that we think the government should do. And so rather than shun it, be a part of making it better. And you can do it by joining government yourself or by holding those who are in government accountable, first with your vote, but then doing what those kids from Florida did, which is go and say, now that you're in office, this is what I want you to do to better represent me. And each of you have the power to do that. And you can do it in a way that is civil. I mean, you guys know, like, I'm a lifelong Democrat. I have very strong political feelings. You haven't heard any of that in this conversation. I'm very careful about the tone that I use. And I think we have to model the kind of behavior that we want to see from others. And that you have the power to do right this minute.
I think, just to jump in here real quick, I think we have some time for about 3 more questions, unless they're quick responses, but I just want to be really conscious of Ms. Jarrett's time.
I will be quicker so that we can get to as many questions as possible.
Great, sounds good. So the next question that we have is going to be from Lisa Einstein. So Lisa, you can speak right now.
Hey, Lisa.
Hello, thank you so much. You can hear me?
Yes, can hear you fine.
Yes, thank you so much. I want you to imagine that you're the governor of a state that has ordered citizens to stay home, where we're now seeing spreading protests against the quarantine. So like in Michigan, for example. How would you communicate with your constituents to persuade them to obey the mandate to stay home, particularly if they're not in your political party?
Well, to me, this virus should have nothing to do with political party. And I've looked at some of the polling. It's interesting to me how we are consuming information these days. This is something I've been worried about, and this virus kind of proves the point that people are looking at the impact that this virus might have along political lines, and they shouldn't. They should be looking at it along scientific lines, which has nothing to do with politics. And so I think what the governor of any state, including Michigan, has to do is meet people where they are. And you have to send out teams of people into these crowded areas and try to educate them on the science. And it's hard to do simply from the bully pulpit, although the bully pulpit is important. But it's more likely to be persuadable if you go in and you tell stories where people can see themselves in those stories. And so if you go into a crowded bar with a bunch of young people and you say, look, let me tell you what I just observed, and take some healthcare providers with you and say, I have found what's most powerful for me on television is looking at these nurses and doctors who've been treating these COVID patients, and their faces are all bruised from wearing the masks, and they're sobbing about showing FaceTime family members as their loved ones are dying. And those stories scare me and depress me and motivate me to want to stay home. And look, I haven't seen my mother in 3 months, 4 months actually, 4 months, since this, way before this began, because she's in Chicago and I'm in New York. And let's face it, nobody wants anybody from New York to come knocking on their door. And so I think the way you motivate people is helping them understand how this can affect them. And look, I understand the motivation of wanting to go back to work particularly. I don't really understand the motivation of wanting to go hang out at a bar. And particularly when you think that that's going to not just put your life in jeopardy and the people who are in the bar, but everybody's going to leave that bar and go somewhere. And now that we know it's not just you have to worry about your grandparents or your parents, you've got to worry about children. I mean, everybody is vulnerable. And so you can't state it enough. And I give the governor of Michigan credit for really trying to come down hard in New York. They're beginning to give tickets to people who are assembling too close to one another, who don't disperse. And I don't think tickets is the only solution. I think persuasion is a better solution, because you give them a ticket and then they go down another block and they come back out again. And look, this is hard. I'm much older than you guys, but none of us have ever been through anything even remotely like this before. And it's painful, it's scary, it's hard, but we will get through this. And I think part of the challenge here is people don't see an end in sight. And the science is being very clear that the end might not be soon as we would want it to be. But that's life. And the question is, do we have the resilience and the grit and the creativity to deal with it and do it in a way where we're not just stretching this out? All right, I've talked too long on that one question, but I think you have to communicate is the best solution, and it has to be on the ground. It can't just be from afar. Personally communicate.
No, I definitely agree. I think it's super important that we all realize that, we're all in this together, really. Our next question comes from Athena Chang. So Athena, if you'd like to ask your question, please.
Hi, Athena.
Hi, thank you so much for talking to us. So my question is, what is the one best memory you have of working with the Obamas?
Well, I have a very long story, which I don't have the time to tell you, that's in my book. It's called Pinch Me Moments. But I'll say it simply as this, like every single day, the pride I felt when I drove through the gates of the White House, and I would pause and think about a gentleman who met on the campaign trail who gave President Obama a patch from his military uniform. And President Obama didn't want to take it because he realized what it was. And this guy says, carried it for 40 years and I want you to have it. And I just thought that was such a symbol of what his campaign was supposed to be about, which is like ordinary people making sacrifices, feeling a part of the greater good. Some of the motivation that drove me into public service in the first place from a guy who was operating an elevator in our hotel for 3 days, and he separates from a gift he'd carried with him for 40 years. And so every day when I would drive through the gates of the White House, I would think about that man. His name is Earl Smith. And say, try to do something today to make him proud, to make that sacrifice of giving up that possession, that prized possession, worthy. And look, there were some hard days in that White House. There wasn't a single day where there was anywhere else I would have rather been than there, even on the worst moments. And part of it is knowing that there were people like Earl out there who were counting on us.
Great. And our final question for the webinar is going to come from Thea Rosenberg. So Thea, you can ask your question.
Hey there.
Hi, Ms. Jarrett. Thank you so much for talking with us today. My name is Thea, and I'm a student from Norway. And my question is about your definition of leadership. So if you were to define leadership, what would your definition be? And along with that, could you also perhaps please share an experience from your time at Stanford that sort of helped shape your leadership style or your definition of leadership? Thank you.
Yeah, I think leadership is about mobilizing people to take action. It's about being a role model and leading by example. So if you want people to follow your lead, you should live up to the ideals of what you're asking them to do. Don't ask them to do anything that you haven't or wouldn't be willing to do yourself. I think leadership is about listening. You can't lead unless you understand the hearts and the minds of the people that you're trying to lead. So you've got to be proximate and get to know them in order to lead them, because they won't follow you unless you do. And that listening leads to trust. And trust is a sacred covenant of leadership. I know during our time in office, we asked people to make enormous sacrifices. We set people into harm's way, serving in the military. And they do that because they believe in the office and hopefully the person, and they also believe in the mission. And so you have to be an excellent communicator as well. You can't just communicate one time, back to the question of what to do in states like Michigan. It has to be a relationship that you develop over time. And recognizing the nature of relationships require honesty, integrity, character, reliability, steadiness. These are all qualities that I think come from leadership. And perhaps the most important one is that it's not about you. I mean, if you're truly a leader that's trying to be a force for good, and when you said leadership, I assume you meant good leadership, because I can give you examples of bad leadership too. But good leadership, I look at as people who are trying to make their business, their city, their country better. And if that's truly what's motivating you, then it can't be about you. And you do have to learn how to, as I describe in my book, absorb pain in a way that doesn't make you numb it and doesn't debilitate you. And it's easier to absorb that pain. And I got a lot of practice at it in local government in Chicago, believe me, being in the eye of the storm and having to get used to that and having to say, well, I can't spend all day worrying about a newspaper article because there are people out there who need basic services that we're trying to provide them. And so when you get over the sense that it's about you, and it's actually the difference between politics and service. And there are some people who enjoy both. There are some people who are just politicians, and there are some who are just public servants. And maybe I'll close with a story. Shall we do that? And it kind of wraps this all up, I think, into a nice little package. So we talked a bit earlier about the Affordable Care Act, and it was just an extraordinarily difficult accomplishment. And just about everything that could go wrong went wrong. The Republicans had made up their mind that even with 200 amendments, they were going to form a solid block and not vote for it. Senator Kennedy died in the middle of it, and he was a staunch supporter of it. Every possible legislative sausage-making problem you can imagine arose. We spent a whole summer really, really trying to make it bipartisan because we thought anytime you do something as big as this, it will be easier to absorb into the mainstream if it is a bipartisan bill, and we were unsuccessful in that. Long story short, the night that the Affordable Care Act passed, I went to my home. And one of my best friends, who actually is the person who sent me Michelle Robinson's resume, to my point earlier about importance of relationships, now almost 30 years ago, lived across the hall. She was a lawyer working on healthcare for the White House. And so we're sitting on the couch getting ready to watch the vote, and a bowl of popcorn, glass of wine, pajamas. And the president's assistant calls and she says, the president would like everybody who worked on the Affordable Care Act to come back to the White House and be there for the vote. And I said, oh, Katie, you know what? I'm fine. Susan's fine. We got our pajamas on. And she said, perhaps you didn't hear me. President Obama would like everybody who worked on the Affordable Care Act to come back to the White House. And so I was like, oh, that's right. You are my boss. Okay, so we traipse on back to the White House. It's only 10 minutes away. Watch the vote. And at the end of the vote, in a moment of impulsivity, President Obama says, everybody come upstairs and celebrate, upstairs to his personal residence. Well, the only reason he got away with that is that his wife was out of town. But I kept imagining the Secret Service, you know, his name was Renegade, so you can hear him go like, Renegade plus 100 moving up to the residence, because there were 100 of us gathered. So we have a great party up in the residence, and their residence was really off limits except to friends and family. And so most of the folks there hadn't been upstairs, and it was an unseasonably warm spring evening that felt to me, as we were standing out on the Truman balcony, my favorite place in the entire White House, the temperature felt like it did back on Election Day in 2008. And so at about 2 in the morning, I sidled up to President Obama, and I had 2 martinis. I'm not going to tell you what he'd had. I'll confess to myself, because we were all so jubilant. And I was feeling a little nostalgic, and I said, you know, you were so happy tonight, because he'd gone around and he thanked every single person on that balcony personally for their role in getting it passed, from the vice president to a junior person on my staff who read letters from people with healthcare challenges and then put those letters into President Obama's speeches. I said, how do you feel now, this night, compared to how you felt on election night? And he looked at me as we're gazing out over the South Lawn and the Washington monuments twinkling in the background and the Jefferson memorials all lit up. And it's just a spectacular view of history. And he said, Valerie, there's no comparison between the two. Election night was simply the means to get to this night. And that's the difference to me between politics and service. And you have to go through the politics and win the elections in order to have the privilege to serve, but it can't be just about the election. It has to be about the service.
Great. Thank you so much. First off the entire talk, but especially that last story. It was incredibly interesting to hear. And I think it's super important that people understand what public service actually is. And it's not just about, you know, debating people on the other side. It's about actually serving the country. And so I really appreciate you for sharing that. So in line with the idea of service, we actually have a few quick announcements. So first we'll start off with one of the audience members, Andrew, who's actually going to talk a little bit about cardinal careers. So Andrew, why don't you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, this is Andrew Epifanio at the Haas. I work at the Haas Center for Public Service. I'm part of the Cardinal Careers team there. And I'll just keep this to 30 seconds and say that we actually have, to Valerie's point, we have a variety of resources around getting started in a career in public service, including a newsletter that has jobs, postgraduate fellowships and internships. We offer advising. We have a new guide to getting started in public service that has postgrad fellowships in it, as well as organizations and some other things. What I'll do is I will try to link it in the chat, and then I'll also see if we can follow up with links to those individual resources after this call.
Great, thank you so much for that, Andrew. Just a few more quick announcements. So again, I know we talked a lot about public service, and we had a tremendous event today, and I was certainly incredibly excited by it, and I definitely heard so many interesting stories and got a really interesting perspective, and I really appreciate that. So in that same line, SIG actually has a few more events coming up that are going to be in line with the idea of public service. So this coming, let's see here, it should be this coming Monday. We will be having an event with former Senator Jeff Flake from Arizona. So you can check that out, and there will be a link for people who want to attend in the chat. And then 1 week from now, on Thursday, we'll be hearing a talk from former Defense Secretary General Jim Mattis on the importance of public service. So please, please, please come to those events. They're going to be, incredibly interesting. They'll bring new perspectives. And so it's just going to be a great way for people, of all backgrounds to really understand what service means and, I guess what's going on in the country right now and how we can actually put it in perspective. And then finally, before, hopefully it should happen when you close out of the webinar, but there will be a survey for you to fill out. Please fill it out. That helps us get more feedback on what we've done, well during this webinar, what we can do better, as you know, because we have future webinars coming up and we want to make sure we make them as great as possible. So I guess with that, that's about all we have. First off, thanks to everyone who came. And thank you so much, Ms. Jarrett, for taking the time to speak with us. We really appreciated it. It was so interesting.
My pleasure being with you all. And look, I know,
so thrilled by it.
I know this is not what you all were expecting for your semester and maybe even next year, but you'll have an incredible education, whether it's virtually or not. So take that education and do something really special with it. We have high hopes for your generation.
Great. Thank you so much for that. We really appreciate it. And thank you everyone who came out and attended. We really appreciate it. Please fill out the survey and please come to the events coming up on Monday and Thursday. They're going to be terrific. So please come out to those. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
Bye, everybody. Take care. Good luck to you. Stay safe.